This war from the Chinese perspective is win-win. If Russia wins and Europe is distracted, destabilized, that's good for China. China can move right in. On the other hand, if the Russians lose, well, then the Russians' hold on everything becomes shakier, and maybe the Chinese can take advantage of that in Central Asia or even in parts of Russia.
The CIA director and the Secretary of State, both out publicly warning about the potential of China arming Russia in its war with Ukraine. The Chinese also refused to sign an international pledge that condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 1 year after the invasion began, parts of Ukraine have been destroyed. Russia has lost tens of thousands of soldiers, and there is no end in sight to the war. Joining us now, the Vice President of Foreign and Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation, James Carafano. James, how real is the threat that China might arm Russia in its war against Ukraine?
Well, this is one of the really head-puzzling stories that's out there. You have to understand that China's going to do what's best for China, and that's all they care about. And so what exactly they would gain from physically arming the Russians is kind of hard to tell. The Russian troops are increasingly less trained, less capable. And so is it really going to make a difference on the battlefield whether Russians die with Russian equipment or Chinese equipment? And of course, it's raised a blowback from the West. But you also have to understand what the Chinese say and what they do can often be two completely different things. So they may have no intention whatsoever of arming the Russians, or they may be doing something in between. But it's doubt that they can or would willing to do anything that's going to really shift the balance of the war on the ground in Ukraine.
Wait, do you think the insert of Chinese weapons to the battlefield would really be an upgrade for the Russians? Obviously, it would take a training issue. And they're not well trained to begin with.
Right. So I was in the military for 25 years, and I got to tell you, it's the man behind the trigger that really, or the woman behind the trigger that really makes all the difference. And so even with relatively simple to operate things like killer drones, which is, you could do that if you know how to do games and stuff, it's very doubtful that the Russians would really be able to utilize equipment in a way that would significantly allow them to perform better on the ground. You can see this just watching YouTubes of the Russian military in battle. Literally what they're trying to do, the strategy is to exhaust the Ukrainians into quitting, and they're doing that by throwing Russians at the front line and watching them die.
Yeah, James, as you well know, the Chinese do not think in terms of the next election cycle or the next 1 year, 2 years, 4 years. They're always looking at 10 plus years out. Could this be a negotiation tactic to say, insert with what the U.S. is talking about doing in Taiwan, something to give leverage to the Chinese in dealing with President Joe Biden?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. Certainly one is all their messaging is designed to go where it's most easily accepted and held, and that's really in the global South. They're not going to convince the Americans they're the good guys. They don't have to convince the Russians they're their friends. Europeans are increasingly skeptical of the Chinese. The only people who are willing to listen to these messages that the Chinese are the peacemaker, or the Chinese are a neutral party, or the Chinese are just helping out, are people in the global South who are being paid off by the Chinese and are kind of willing to absorb these messages. So that's something that we know for sure. You know, down the road, to be honest, this war from the Chinese perspective is win-win. If Russia wins and Europe is distracted, destabilized, that's good for China. China can move right in. On the other hand, if the Russians lose, well, then the Russians' hold on everything becomes shakier, and maybe the Chinese can take advantage of that in Central Asia or even in parts of Russia. So I think all they're really interested in here, when you're saying look 10, 20 years down the road, is no matter how this comes out, all they're interested in is how can we make sure it benefits China?
Well, and to that point, you know, one of the things you have to think about is, and as there is dissension in America in certain sectors about arming Ukraine or continuing U.S. support for Ukraine, one of the answers is we need to get this over with to shift our focus where it needs to be, which is on China. So China, in trying to continue this battle, could at least delay that.
Yeah, that's a pretty superficial argument. Look, not that I'm all for focusing American military capacity on deterring China with strong conventional and strategic forces. That ought to be our number one goal. There's no question there. But having said that, this notion that somehow supporting Ukraine is distracting us from dealing with China is actually not really factually true. First of all, our Navy, 70% of our Navy is already in the Indo-Pacific, and there's virtually no Navy fighting in Europe, and the Pacific is mostly a maritime theater. So that argument doesn't hold water. 90% of the US military is in the United States. So yeah, we've had a few more troops in Europe helping support logistically Ukrainians and helping the Poles with, Patriots and stuff like that, but it's not a very significant number. And even the munitions that we're depleting, these are not the munitions that we're going to use in the war to fight against China. 155 artillery ammunition, as you know, is used in a land war. I mean, I don't think we're going to be fighting a land war, over Taiwan. Now, having said that, the munitions is a good example. There's real challenges there. The Japanese would fight to support Taiwan. Their Air Force has enough missiles for about 3 sorties, and then they're out of ammunition. So we've got real issues with bulking up to deal with China. But the notion that somehow supporting Ukraine, which is degrading arguably China's most important ally, is distracting us from this shift, I don't think that's true. Matter of fact, I think what we're going to see is, because of the successes in bulking up Europe, getting the Europeans to do a lot more, doing more burden sharing, building up their own defense industries, that actually is going to allow us to focus a lot more on China, which is what we should be doing.
Yeah, tomorrow the Senate Armed Services Committee is going to have a hearing on Ukraine, and I think one of the big topics, to your larger point, is about F-16s. Do you think that even should be a discussion, given your argument that really our assets are where they need to be?
Well, I think the air issue is a bit of a distraction at this point. Yes, Ukraine is going to need an air force to defend Ukraine's airspace, but that's not going to determine the outcome of this conflict. It's going to take months and years to build up a capable Ukrainian air force. And what exactly look like, what kind of airframes they have, and I think there's plenty of time for that debate and discussion. So this isn't something that's going to impact how this war finishes up. This is what goes after that. And I think Congress should absolutely get in a debate that. One of the real frustrations for me has been is, other than writing checks for a blank check Biden, Congress has been absent at the table here. There's no debate about strategy. There's no debate about what the priorities are. There's no real debate about, is oversight adequate. Congress should get its head in the game. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation. We look forward to having you back. Kevin Kiley has been very active in uncovering the censorship of conservatives, but he's also very public about his faith, in part because his brother is a pastor. Congressman, welcome to Centerpoint. You're at the right place.
That's great to be with you. Thank you.
So, Congressman, a lot of it, I think we blame or credit Elon Musk for uncovering what we've all known to be true for so long. But just how bad is the censorship that we're starting to see at so many levels?
Well, I think the answer to that is unclear. We don't know because what we've really only seen so far is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we had this fortuitous event where someone who values free speech and values transparency came into ownership of a major social media company. If it weren't for that, then a lot of this would still not have been revealed. And so there is, that's just the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion. We have plenty of evidence that the government was working hand in hand with these major social media companies to censor the speech of political opponents or to censor opinions that they found inconvenient or that they were opposed to or were critical of the current policy. So this is a textbook violation of the First Amendment. Nothing could be more antithetical to the principles that have really the foundation of our country from the founding. And I think that, it is truly alarming what we're learning, but it's very important that we do figure out the full depth of it and just how pervasive this has been so that there can be accountability and we can make sure that this does not continue to happen going forward.
Congressman, I know we have seen it happen a lot around certain topics, whether that be vaccines, COVID information, and political beliefs, but we're also starting to see censorship. And I think this is something, obviously, because of your brother's work as a pastor, about censoring people who believe in faith, who believe in God. And it's something that's, how can that be allowed?
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, in my state of California, there has been a full assault on religious liberty for quite some time, where people of faith have been targeted by our state government, by our legislature, by our governor. And of course, this all culminated with something that would have truly horrified our founders, which is that the government tried to shut down churches. And in fact, in California, it was so bad that on 5 separate occasions, the United States Supreme Court had to overturn orders of Gavin Newsom that infringed upon religious liberty. And so I think that, that's just another example of how the First Amendment has been thrown by the wayside by some who are in positions of power. And I think that, one of the things that hopefully will come out of this sort of, culmination of all of these abuses and everything we've been through over the last few years is that it is an opportunity to turn a corner, to get back to the principles of our founding: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the ability of each person to live their lives as they see fit and without interference by the government. So hopefully this is an opportunity where we can get the pendulum swinging back the other way.
Speaking of pendulums that have swung, obviously what we have seen going on at the southern border has been nothing short of remarkable and heartbreaking here in the last couple of years. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I know you were just down at the border. You had a field hearing down there in, I believe, Yuma, Arizona. Give the viewers a sense of what we're really seeing going on down there, not just at the southern border, but now also at our northern border.
Well, that's right. I mean, the scale of the problem really boggles the mind. I mean, every month we're setting new records in terms of the number of folks illegally crossing the border. They're bringing record amounts of fentanyl. There's unprecedented, amounts of human trafficking that this is causing and contributing to, and people are suffering. There's an unprecedented number of migrants who are dying crossing the border, and this administration has instituted a set of policies that very predictably led to this outcome where they reversed policies that were working. And so we held a field hearing at the border. We saw the damage that is being done. We saw the way that hospitals are being overwhelmed by folks crossing illegally and all the other problems that this is causing. And so I'm hopeful that we can, we've now reached the worst of the worst, and we can start to get back to some common sense. But so far, there aren't any signs that the administration is willing to do that.
One of the things with the new House majority being in charge, what can Congress do to either highlight the problem but also push for solutions to the southern border?
Well, first of all, we do need to get to the root of the problem and look at what the likes of Secretary Mayorkas have done to bring this crisis about, what was known, what sort of actions have been taken, the ways in which they have exceeded the authorizations from Congress. And much more. But also there is a lot of bills that need to pass in order to fund the government, in order to keep the government going. And so those are opportunities then to insist on changes that will be incorporated into those bills.
Well, Congressman Kevin Kiley of California, thank you for joining Centerpoint.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.